Hello and welcome to the Bigger Than Us podcast. I'm your host, Raj Daniels, and today I'd like to welcome Mike Casey to the show. Mike is the founder of Tigercomm, where he counsels clean tech executives, investors, and philanthropists on strategies for meeting their business objectives. Mike, how are you doing today?
I'm really good, Raj. Thanks for having me on the show.
Thanks for being on, Mike. Mike, I'd like to kick things off with something interesting about my guests that most people wouldn't know. So if you'd like to share, I'd really appreciate it.
Well, that's a tough question, Raj. I think I'm pretty boring. When victory for you on a Saturday night is being in bed at 11 o'clock with a book, I think you're past your point in your life where you're interesting. But I suppose the thing that most people are interested in when they learn about me is that I'm leading, I guess, not quite a double life, but a life and a half, where the other half of the life is spent on the mat as a pretty serious Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu hobbyist. It's a huge part of my life, and I competed for a while. I'm taking a hiatus while my kids are in high school, and I plan to go back to competition when my son leaves the house in 5 years.
So that is pretty interesting, and I like the way you said double life. I have some experience in that arena too. I was doing it from 98 through 2001, and I exited once we were going to a family wedding, and I had some face scrapes on the mat, and my mother looked at me and said, "What are you doing now?" And I said, "You know what? Maybe it's a little time to stop."
Yeah, I've had at least 3 conversation starter face markings from jiu-jitsu, which, for your listeners who don't know, it's what happens on the ground in UFC.
Mm-hmm.
No one's hitting you, but you do occasionally get an elbow or a knee to your face, and you look like it for a while afterwards. So you end up having some ice-breaking, distinctive looks for a while when you go to trade shows or meetings. But there are worse hobbies, I suppose, and certainly ones that aren't nearly as good for you.
Totally agree. And as for Saturday night, 11 a.m., I think I got you beat. Given the option, I'd be in bed by 9. So my kids kind of look at me. But yep, 9 o'clock with a book sounds pretty good to me.
Yep.
So Mike, give us some background on Tigercomm, what it is and how long you've been doing it.
So Tigercomm is the U.S.'s premier clean economy marketing, communications, and public affairs firm. We service the wind, solar, battery storage, and PACE sectors. We've got other sectors that we do other work in as well, but our mission is to help the U.S. economy transform to a much more sustainable footing as quickly as possible. We've been around for 14 years. We are roughly 15 people spread across the country, and we represent some of the biggest names in clean energy: Trina Solar, Vestas, Renew Financial, Apex, and Eon, to name a few.
So 14 years of doing this, how have you seen the landscape change?
That's a really good question, and we could spend a good hour discussing those changes.
I would love to.
I started this firm to address 3 gaps. I spent 12 years in the environmental community, and along the way, I had 3 slow revelations. One of them is we were trying to beat something with nothing. We were saying no to dirtier legacy ways of doing things, essential things in the economy. But we didn't have something we were saying yes to. The second gap was that we didn't have much in the way of infrastructure to deliver that alternative narrative. And the third was we had, in my opinion, a very low and not very durable talent base in the ranks of clean economy communicators. In all 3 of those areas over the last 14 years, I have seen significant changes, all for the better in the macro sense. And I think that we have a better average communicator working at companies and trade associations. We have many more pieces of effective infrastructure to deliver the narrative, and the narrative is exponentially stronger. So we've gone from 2 or 3% penetration. Now we're in the upper single digits of penetration on the pure clean energy sources. We are rapidly electrifying the vehicle fleet. And yes, we're at the early stage in all of these things, but the pace of growth it's quite strong. And that is in the face of some, I think, uneven execution steps that our sector has taken in some critical ways. But by and large, if someone were to ask me in one sentence or phrase our state of clean economy case making, I would say accelerating momentum, dwindling time.
That's an interesting way to put it. Could you elaborate on some of the cases where you've actually helped individuals, craft their messages?
Yeah, I think one person that I'm particularly proud of, we've done work for, is a guy named Chris Brown, who is the president of Vestas North America. Chris has notched the largest single sale of wind turbines in the history of the world, 2 gigawatt sale.
Wow.
Yeah, and he's a extremely bright man. I affectionately tell him that he's a whirling dervish. I mean, he's a mile a minute guy. He has done, I think he has become, by all accounts, the most prominent voice in the wind industry during our service for him. And I think he has a potential to become one of the more prominent voices in the clean energy sectors writ large, because Vestas has indicated its interest publicly in moving into both solar and storage. I think Mark Goodwin, who's the CEO of Apex, he started off like other counterparts at the primarily wind IPPs with very low LinkedIn following. Now Mark routinely gets 10,000 plus views per post on LinkedIn, which has become, I think, by all accounts, the premier B2B Marcom platform, social media platform for the clean economy.
Agree.
I could go on, but I think those two gentlemen are they're particularly prominent. I would say I'm close to 2 real powerhouse women in the sector. One is Stephanie McClellan, who is not only a client but a dear friend of mine, and as the head of the Special Initiative in Offshore Wind, she's widely credited with bringing forth the U.S. offshore wind industry, and we now are seeing her nonprofit, philanthropically backed effort in a bit of a handoff, a baton pass to large offshore wind developers. But Stephanie did some very effective messaging to get an industry set up for success here, I think, in this country. And, the offshore wind potential is huge. And I think also another friend of mine who we've done some work for as well is Abby Hopper. And I think we've done less to help her find her voice than we have others. We played a very bit role, but just her prominence and her rising voice in the space has been, it's been very exciting to be around, because I think solar's continues in this very explosive growth. And she's done a lot of credit to the early work done by Scott Sklar and then Roan Resch, who were her 2 predecessors running SIA. And Abby, I think, is a worthy successor to their legacy.
When these individuals come to you, what are some of the steps you help them to, help them find their voice?
In all of these cases, we want to start with the management consultant's question that Simon Sinek, I think he's the one articulated, start with why. What is our desired future state that we want to get to? So clear definition of point B, and then clear definition of point A. Those 2 things, being clear-eyed about them and being ruthless in their definition, helps you then identify the most important group of people you want to talk to. Once you've gotten those two eat your peas steps down, what's our outcome and who's
Mm-hmm.
going to give it to us? Then you can move to what we call the fun zone of communications work, which is the creative derivation of the language you want to use that will speak to that audience's existing beliefs, self-interest, and values. And a lot of communications work takes place in that third step, but there's a lot of, in my opinion, under focus on those first two foundational steps. Where do we want to get to? Who's going to give it to us? in the final, who has the final say so? Who casts the vote? Who writes the check? Who makes the purchase decision? Who decides to make an investment in the company? And I think we've joked over the years that we're the vegetable leaders in the clean economy communication space. We believe very much in eating vegetables before we go to dessert. And to the point, I think sometimes of being boorish, but we have a really good client set that puts up with our nudging on these fronts. And we were just doing a session that I described last week for a very exciting company. We're not able to discuss our work for them publicly yet, but I think they're going to be a very interesting storage and grid stabilization play in the months ahead, and you will definitely be hearing about them.
The fun zone. Can you share more?
The fun zone of messaging and message delivery?
Correct.
Yeah. Well, we've got certain methodologies that we use to help distill a person, a product, or a company down to its essence. And there are many ways to do that in the consulting world. There are message boxes, there are message triangles, there are message houses. Over time, I have found that those ways, though they seem simple, they don't have that intuitive appeal. They're more PC than Apple. And we've got a system that we like better. It seems to perform better with a wider variety of people, where we try to distill the company, product, or person down to three of the most essential points. And then we use those, we take the essence of each of those 3 points and we compact them into what we call a top line, or the most important elevator pitch that you can give. What's challenging and professionally very interesting is the era that we're in now, what Seth Godin calls the long tail era. The balancing act is to keep the brand essence that you come up with through a certain methodology, but then you vary the message essence, the brand essence, just enough to get it to really speak to a diverse set of prioritized audiences that make up your long tail cohorts.
You've mentioned two of my favorite authors, Simon Sinek and Seth Godin. Going back to Simon Sinek for a moment, what is your why? Why are you pursuing this so hard the last 14 years?
The origins of this company, unbeknownst to me, came about when I read the first textbook I read in the first college course that I took at Ohio State University. It was The 29th Day by Lester Brown, who I think is still alive. And at the time, he was the preeminent environmental trends counter in the world. And he wrote this book, and it was one of many that he had and went on to write, that had largely the same orientation, which is we as human caretakers of our home, that is this earth, we are not long-term thinkers. We do not have the Iroquois Indian perspective of 7 generations. So we end up collectively treating our pantry like a toilet, our living room like a garbage can. And we have this idea that there is an away and throwaway, when really there isn't. It's a closed loop system, and what you throw out, you're going to end up eating. And we're finding that now. Literally, the plastic we have thrown away is breaking down into microplastics and ingesting the seafood that we eat. So literally the plastic that other people have thrown away is now coming back into me when I have a piece of shrimp. And when I read that premise 33 years ago, 34 years ago, it really riveted me. And I said, I'm going to spend my life trying to address this problem whatever way I can. So I shaped the intervening years with a pretty linear focus on being the best sustainability communicator that I could be. And that took a number of paths. I spent 10 years in politics. I spent 10 to 12 years in the environmental movement. And then I've spent the last 14 years building this firm. There's some overlap at the start and end to each of those three eras. But that's really been the focus, is how do we publicly case make to human beings who are by biological wiring short-term focused? How do we get them to think long-term? And I'm still chipping away at it. We've had some short-term wins. I can't tell you the environmental trends are going in the direction that any of us will want them to go in a macro sense. But Confucius said once, better to light one candle than to curse the darkness. And the older I get, the more sanctuary that I find in really leaning into this idea that you do what you can do, and you do it with extreme focus and extreme detachment on the thing relative to the things that you cannot affect. And I think Trump is an invitation for extreme detachment.
That's an interesting way to put it. And, you mentioned the word caretaker earlier. And, along with you, I believe that we are stewards of everything we've been given. And it's incumbent on us to be good stewards of the environment, ourselves, our bodies, family, finances. So totally agree with you.
Yeah, and I think when I turned 50, I spent a week with 500 of my best friends at a Eckhart Tolle seminar. And I spent years raging at polluter industry lobbyists. To me, they were a parasitical class of people whose motivations I found completely revolting. I, for years, thought that they were the more equivalent of drug pushers. They knew that they were doing evil. They convinced themselves that the evil they were doing was okay because they kind of had excuses that sounded like drug dealers would offer. Hey, if I don't do it, someone else will do it. Everybody, hey, it's nobody's business. It's a harmless thing to do, et cetera. No, actually, it's very harmful. But as time got on and I matured and I became less furious about that, I began to see the drag on effectiveness that rage and anger are. And when I went to that Eckhart Tolle seminar, about two-thirds of the way through, it struck me that we really don't have a sustainability problem in this country or a social justice problem. We have a problem of presence.
That's very interesting.
Because I think that if you look at if you ask this bigger question, what is the root of this crazy relationship that we as a society have with the biological foundations of our existence? I think the disconnect is the same disconnect that have people treat each other badly because of differences in sexual orientation, skin color, socioeconomic status, nationality. And the more unconscious that we are, the more damage that we as human beings can go do. That is not to say that we should all meditate in caves. It's not to say that the solution to the sustainability problems we have can be found solely in the church pew. But I do think that the more presence more people can have, the faster we will solve these existential problems. And I think sustainability is the king of the problems as a lack of consciousness manifests, because unlike other problems that humanity faces, environmental and sustainability problems, whatever is lost can never be regained. So you can argue that racial divisions, there is an endpoint to racial divisions. If you look at the demographic trends over time, the younger generations are seeing racial differences as less than the prior generations. Demographically, we're becoming a more diverse country. And even if you did nothing in these areas, which I'm obviously not advocating that we do, there is a demographic and attitudinal undercurrent that takes us to a place of greater justice, greater harmony, and greater relatedness among people.
Mm-hmm.
However, the opposite is true with sustainability problems. You cannot unextinct a species. You cannot uncontaminate an aquifer. You cannot unpave a wetland. And you cannot get Japanese stilt grass out of a northeastern US forest. You can't get kudzu out of southeastern swamplands. You just go on and on and on. So the contamination of the biosphere, the scrambling of the biota, the poisoning of water supplies, you're talking about degrading the very bottom of Maslow's hierarchy of needs, our ability to meet our most basic needs. And
Mm-hmm.
it's the problem that's going to affect 100% of people on the planet, not evenly and not all at once, but it's going to affect all of us. We're all in it together. There is no planet B, and we're acting as if it doesn't matter because we can just bury ourselves in a video game or on YouTube. And I
Mm-hmm.
think what we're finding now in the research on human happiness is that past a fairly low level of material needs met, more money, more busyness, more electronic noise does not make you happier. In fact, it's the opposite. And there's a hopeful
Right.
message in that. I think there's because as someone who has, I counted one time after reading Malcolm Gladwell's The Outliers,
Mm-hmm.
he quoted that statistic that at 10,000 hours of deliberate, intentional practice at a particular skill is when you can expect to achieve mastery. I did a back of the envelope calculation and I found out I'd spent 65,000 hours of intentional focus and practice in my professional life. Now, does that make me a master? I'll leave that for others to decide. But I think it does give me historical perspective. My career started pre-internet, so I've had the benefit of both pre and post-internet commencement, and I've been able to see where the trends go. And I really think that this problem is existential, and it's so big. It's the worst problem we've ever faced in the world and in the history of the world, that we are only going to be successful in getting ourselves and our fellow humans to move in the right direction if we're having a conversation at a level of presence and more immediate levels, policy, buying habits, etc.
So I think it's very interesting that you're bringing it back to the common denominator of presence. I would agree with you wholeheartedly, and I've got a lot of experience in the digital space and software space, and you know, unfortunately, from what I'm seeing, even though there are some movements where individuals are trying to regain presence, I still see a lot of challenges in the future, especially in the younger generations. I have young children too, and I see all the attempts to distract them and to take their attention away from perhaps what's at hand or what's important. So I think that's really interesting that you brought it back to presence. And teeing off on that, if there's a piece of advice that you could share with the audience, what would it be?
So let me walk the walk of the methodology that I gave you. Who is our audience on this show? Or which segment of your show's audience would you like me to address that to?
Well, I'll tell you who the broader audience is. The broader audience is individuals that are interested in hearing the stories of individuals that are part of this sustainability renewable movement. That's the broader audience. If I could bring it even narrower, what we're finding is that there are many in the development community in renewable and sustainable. There are people that are interested in the financing of projects. So that's a more narrow focus. But the broader focus is actually, I'm trying to uncover individuals like you and why you've been part of this journey.
So let me take your question in the context of the audience that you defined it narrowly as being. My advice to them is going to be the focus of an upcoming post I'm going to be writing. which is the case to stop using opaque terms in the way we communicate. There's a blessing in working for clean economy companies, and you end up working for some incredibly smart people.
Mm-hmm.
Brilliant people advancing technology and management structures and problem solving in ways I could never do. And it's thrilling to work with and for them. At the same time, that brilliance ends up almost handicapping them from communicating in ways that follow the current rules of the road. What we're seeing is that Americans spend 5.7 hours a day on screens and counting. We're bombarded with estimates from 15,000 to 55,000 messages a day. And there's controversial estimates about the attention span of people that's going south of 8 seconds. And the point is that you have less and less time to get and hold attention. Therefore, shame on you if you use jargon, if you use acronyms, if you use non-conversational language. We have in our firm what we call the supermarket checkout line test. So when we message a company, can you use that messaging next weekend if you're in line at Whole Foods and the person behind you asks you what you do? Can you explain to them in terms that they can get if that person works at a retail store or drives a truck or stocks grocery shelves for a living? Can you explain it to them? Richard Branson once said, any fool can complicate something. It takes a master to simplify it. So I want to make a case to clean economy executive teams that we have an enduring passion for plain, powerful language. Because if you must use jargon and insider terms to explain your product offering, you are handicapping yourself right out of the box, and unnecessarily so. I have never seen a product or company or person that cannot be messaged to pass the supermarket checkout line. Not one time. And I've been professionally messaging as a consultant for the better part of 15 years, and I've been messaging complex topics for 34 years. Never seen it.
Wow. So give me an example of some of these opaque terms. I'd like to know some. Make sure I'm not using them.
Carbon emissions, greenhouse gases. I could just, I want to get my confirmation class nun to come out of the retirement home with her ruler and smack the hand of everybody who uses these stupid terms. Stop using the word emissions. It's a nothing term. It's pollution. It's pollution. Why don't we use the term pollution? Why do you use the greenhouse gases? Why do we call this global warming or climate change? If I could go back in time, we would have called it global climate disruption. Why? Because for the last 25 years, we could own the cold stuff.
Have you read the book by Frank Luntz?
Yes.
Words That Work?
Yes, many times.
He's one of my favorite guys, and I, not from a political standpoint, but just from a wordsmithing standpoint, and I totally agree with you. In fact, this weekend, and let me see if I pass your test. This weekend, I was sitting with my father-in-law, and the topic of work came up, and I had to mention anaerobic digestion, and he said, the kind of the blank look came across, and I said, well, just imagine it being like your stomach, and he got it right away.
Yes.
So
I've actually I've been around Frank Luntz. He invited me to his house one time for a party. I've spent significant time around him. And he is a brilliant man, but what he's particularly brilliant at is communicating what he finds in focus groups. There's controversy in the public opinion research industry on whether or not his methods for harvesting public opinion insights are as good as others. And I can't tell you that I can settle that controversy. But what I can tell you firsthand is he is very, very good at communicating the power of simplicity in well-chosen language. And the more jargony you are, the less powerfully you are communicating, even in expert circles. And what I found in training these 2,000 plus people is that the smarter somebody is, the more specialized his or her expertise is, pretty reliably, the more resistant they are to using plain language and repetition in a disciplined message delivery task.
I can see that, especially the repetition piece, because I feel like what my experience is, and I had my own company in the past, and there's this book I keep on my table regarding the immutable laws of marketing. And one of the things that Al Ries talks about, I think he talks about this, is that if you're not sick of hearing your message, you haven't said it enough.
Yeah, that's 100% true. I would use even more gripping analogies about the sickness of hearing your own message, but he's 100% right.
So let's go back to something earlier in the conversation. It's Saturday night, 11 p.m. What are you reading?
I'm currently, I read in two forms. There's recreational reading that I do on my off hours. And I think I just finished a Bill Bryson book on Australia. I just think he's a lovely writer. It's just fun. And then there's the work reading that I do, which I do primarily through Audible and Blinkist, because I don't find it in me to come home and do firsthand reading on the page of professional advancement work, I guess I'll call it. It's kind of a busman's holiday, and I don't really want to. I need a break when I get home. But I think right now I'm going through a really good series by Google. I think it's called Learn with Google. They've got some really interesting intra-company and external talent that they bring on and have interviews with. I'm also a big fan of David Baker and Blair Inns. I listen to pretty much all their podcast episodes, and yeah, I think those are, and then those are the guys I'm patronizing regularly. But I think the professional books I'm reading, they tend to be about clean tech and clean tech business directions, and then there's just generic Marcom and management skill building.
Got you. Well, Mike, I really appreciate your time today, and I've really enjoyed having you on. I'll be sure to put a link to your site on the post when I post it. Any last bits of advice?
Yeah, I think for the audience that you've identified for this show, I think the more that we can be supporting each other in the production of smart, insight-focused content, the more of an echo chamber we can build around our efforts. And we need to recognize that most of the sectors in the clean economy are not new industries, they are new sectors. And by definition, we are displacing powerful incumbent players within the industries that we are trying to grow. And they're not going to give up market share easily. And they have maturity that had 7, 8, 9 decades that's allowed them to build up an echo chamber around new products, new ideas, smart policy messaging. And we don't have their budgets, but we sure as heck can learn from their wins and their failures and raise our game, albeit at lower budgets. So I think that the most important thing we can do here is understand that as disruptors, we have disruptor needs, but we have to invest like a disruptor would, which is disproportionate to the early stage that most of our companies are at in public case making, whether it's to markets or customers or policymakers.
Well, here's to raising our game, Mike.
Absolutely. Raj, thank you so much.
Appreciate you, Mike. Thank you so much, and we'll catch up with you soon.
Take care. Bye now.